G'day guys, Bergie here with Not a Podcast. I'm with the author of this awesome book, The Catch, Anna Clark. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me, Mark.
Mate, what a cool book. I really like it. Australia's love affair with fishing. We most certainly have a love affair with fishing. Well, I know I do.
Yeah, 100%.
I've got lots of questions for you, and I think we'll just dive straight in. The first one's basically, you're a historian.
Yep.
Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, sure. So I'm a historian. I work at university, so a bit of a nerd.
Okay.
I study Australian history. I'm interested professionally in, I don't know, how history's taught in schools. That's my day job.
I did read that, yep.
But my passion is fishing. So even when I'm, lecturing students or in the library, being a nerd, I'm always dreaming about when I'm going fishing. And when I was asked to do this book, History of Fishing, I couldn't believe it.
Yeah,
Awesome.
How did that come about? That's one of my questions. How did their book come about?
Well, it was a few years ago, and one of the publishers at the National Library of Australia asked, and my agent actually, and said, "Do you know anyone who's a historian who likes fishing?" And they were like,
"Hello,
actually, I do." And I was kind of curious because I've always wanted to write a history of fishing. And I'm surprised that one hasn't been done before. And I was like, well, I suppose people who like fishing aren't writing books, they're fishing.
Well, what's interesting is most of the books that you'll find in the recreational fishing industry are written by people like myself.
Yeah.
They're in the media a bit, and they're just trying to sell a few books or whatever have you. But this is not really like that. This is just like a really honest look of a snapshot, really, of the whole of the history.
Yeah, that's
from start
right.
to finish, which is it's actually quite refreshing.
Yeah, cheers.
Yeah.
I suppose a lot of books that you read about, they're kind of how-to.
100%.
Yeah, and which is great. I love reading those books. But as I was reading and researching this book, what I found really interesting is how much fishers like reading about fishing. And it could be, you can reading about anything. It could be a magazine, could be a book, it could be anything at all.
Mate,
but as soon as people...
anything to do with fishing,
exactly.
we love. We're pathetic.
Yeah.
That's why our show is called Fishing Addiction, because it is 100%. It is an addiction.
Yeah.
And I guess it's like a lot of guys and gals in the country, when they find their hobby or their passion or whatever have you, they really embrace it. And certainly fishing, with the history that it has in this country, and the fact that it doesn't mean a lot to people because there is a sentimental attachment to it through family and so forth, which you do mention in here, which is great. I'm actually going to read a little bit. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely.
I loved this bit. It was a little bit sappy, but I totally related to it,
okay.
Right? And it was the very beginning, the introduction. When they shut their eyes and pause for a minute, fishers have a place they go in their mind, a special place, a fishing place. Mine is called Paradise, but you won't find it on any map. I can be anywhere, hanging out the washing, sitting in traffic, waiting at a bus stop, and this glorious daydream appears. When the sun catches the side of my face, I close my eyes and I'm there, standing on the water's edge at Paradise in the late afternoon. That when I read that straight away, I thought, you consciously don't think of those moments. And you've written that, and I thought, that happens to me like all the time. It's so relatable. And I think a lot of fishers, when they're at work or, no matter where they are, that's the old Corona ad, the place you'd rather be.
Yeah, 100%. And, I often go down to, I live in Sydney, and I often go down to Gordon's Bay. There's a car park there, and I go freediving and sometimes spear fishing out there a little bit. And a number of cars of tradies who've gone down to have their lunch.
Just to have a look.
Having a little look.
Yeah. Are there any bus stops that's happening?
Exactly.
Yeah, interesting. So, couple of other, your love of fishing, obviously, what in particular really gets you excited? Like I noticed in the book you talk about, and we'll touch more on this later, but people have different reasons for wanting to do it. But
sure.
Is it the sentimental attachment? Because I know you used to go down to the south coast of New South Wales. That's actually where I'm from.
Oh, wow.
Originally.
Yeah.
So whereabouts did you go, and what is it in particular?
So my grandparents had a property near Bermagui on the south coast.
Oh my gosh, caught my first kingfish in Bermagui.
Oh, okay. Wow. And we actually, me and my kids and my hubby lived there until pretty recently.
Okay.
So we've been living in Sydney, and then we moved down to live on this property for a while, got the kids in a local school. So I grew up with my dad and my uncles. It was the men. I come from a very male-dominated, not that they were dominating people, but there were many more boys than girls in my family.
Okay.
Loved fishing. And so I just spent my childhood, when I was really little, sitting on the beach watching them fish. And I absolutely Loved it. And then, it was kind of quiet time. And when you're on holidays, your parents have got time to be with you and hang out with you. And so there's sort of, like you said, a kind of a nice nostalgic
100%.
thing there.
Yeah.
But then when you catch your first fish, it's this great thrill. And I suppose it's both. For me, it's that being in place and the kind of well-being, mental health, mindfulness of just sitting or standing and watching and, watching the tide turn or thinking about, getting nippers for a nice flathead or something. But there's also the thrill, which is undeniable. So it's both of those things.
Absolutely. Interesting you mentioned the mental health thing. I think for men in particular, because I could probably relate more to the men, the whole idea of escaping reality and going fishing is really great for men's mental health and women. Have you noticed how many women are getting into fishing? Like Women in Fishing, we did a little podcast with those guys. It's going bananas.
I know, it's amazing. And I suppose, you talk about mental health for guys. Women, I love nothing more than like just going off and being away from my kids for an hour and just clearing my head and having that inner thoughts. So it doesn't surprise me at all. And I think governments and fishing industries are kind of going, actually, there's something in this.
100%.
They really all the licenses that will sell and all the wellbeing aspects and the businesses that can be supported by encouraging women to go out and do it.
Yeah. Why do you think the average Aussie... Actually, really exciting. I was in the airport up in Darwin the other day and just looking through the books, and there it was.
Oh, wow.
At the airport, which is kind of cool.
Yeah, very cool.
I thought you might like that one. Why do you think the average Aussie fisher would like this book?
I suppose I'm hoping that it speaks to them about the story of Australian fishing, and partly it's a story of, environmental challenges. We can't deny that much of Australia was sort of there's been a lot of overfishing, but there's also this passion to keep fishing into the future, and so there's this really strong sense of custodianship, and a lot of the sort of industrial overfishing and so on happened because people didn't really know. They didn't know the depth of the stocks and the extent of the stocks, and there was pressure from governments to expand and
they just did
extract.
Or they just did it until they were told not to because they were making money.
Yeah, absolutely. Or they did it until they couldn't because the fish had gone. So I think that's a really important story to tell, particularly for those of us who want to be able to pass it on to our kids. And there are definitely stories of... so there's a story there of management, which gets stronger and stronger.
Does.
But there's also, I think, I love thinking about how amazing some of those places would have been. And so I think there's something for us to aim for, and for me as a historian, I love looking at those things and go, they caught that many snapper in an hour, or, Aboriginal fishers who were fishing in Sydney Harbour and could just peer over their little canoes and just spear fish. There were that many fish. It was that thick. And I can't pretend that we're definitely going to get back there, but I think it does give us a sense of what we might be aiming for, and to not give up about how, where we can go with environmental management, I suppose, and stewardship.
And we'll talk a little bit more about that later with in relation to rec fishing and commercial fishing and how they sort of are seen, and maybe anyway we'll talk more about that. But in the book, there's a lot about Indigenous fishing practices, which I found really interesting in Australia. One part in particular was the women, how they're in their little rowies or canoes, whatever they're called, and they did all the fishing, whereas the men did the spearing, and they had a little fire going in there and all the rest of it. How do you think you would fit in now? If that was your role,
I'd be right in there. I'd be absolutely cleaning up. Well, I mean, not to mention...
They did it pretty tough, though. They had to travel long distances at times and do all sorts of things like that.
I'm not going to sort of be flippant and say I would like to go back to a time when I wasn't, where we don't have the sort of health and safety wellbeing stuff that we do now. But just to, the sort of the stories of Indigenous women fishing in the Sydney region, hand lining, making line out of Kurrajong tree bark, and Kurrajong means fishing line. So the Kurrajong tree, I walk past a Kurrajong tree now and I'm like, That's
Most
the fishing
people
line
don't.
tree.
Yeah, that's right. That's a really cool thing, actually.
Yeah.
I didn't know that until...
And so there are all
That's pretty
these...
cool.
Pardon me, there are all these kind of literally threads of connection that can tie us today back into this long history of fishing. And I suppose one of the things I really enjoyed about writing this book is it's not thinking about Indigenous communities as doing something that different from what we are doing. And I think that those of us who like fishing can read about some of those fishing practices and just appreciate how it was done and what people were, how people were living.
Oh, man, I tell you, to think what the fishing would have been like, and I fished Sydney Harbour many times myself, and we've had some incredible sessions in there, but just to think, if we went back 200 years, what it would be like. We just did a session down in Tasmania, and it's a private farm. They've owned it for well over 100 years. They have a river that runs through it, and no one has fished it aside from that family for over 100 years.
Wow.
So for us, that's the closest that in my career that I've ever been able to fish somewhere that is that untouched. That's almost a look back in time.
Yeah.
And the fishing was epic. Like, we're catching 4-pounders in a little river that was like 3 meters wide. Absolutely unbelievable. So when you then think of the greater Australia, and there's no doubt the more regional you go, the better the fishing is.
Yeah.
It has less pressure.
Yeah.
But if you think about places like Sydney Harbour, and it is an incredible fishery as it is right now. People don't realise. And how clean it is compared to so many harbours throughout the world. It was already in its own right a fantastic place to go fishing. But just stop and think, 200 years ago, or 250, whatever it might have been, the fishing would have just been like cheating.
And
shooting fish in a barrel, as they say.
Shooting fish in a barrel, and you'd walk down to the rocks and pick up some lobsters.
Just a casual lobster.
A few abs, a couple of lobsters.
Yeah, amazing. Just amazing. The other thing I found really a bit gross, but also just really interesting. Tell us about the pinky finger tradition with the Aboriginal people.
Yeah, that's kind of curious, and I suppose no one actually really knows what its origins are. But for those Aboriginal fisherwomen, when they were very soon after birth, a piece of line of spider web or kangaroo tendon was tied around one of the joints of their left pinky fingers,
right,
and tightened, and then the same way you might put a little rubber on a sheep's tail or something, circulation stopped, and that little piece fell off, which was then taken out and dropped to the fishers below. And so they identified these fisherwomen, because they were missing this sort of part of their pinky finger. And the procedure was called Malgan. And there was some kind of real esteem that if you were a fisherwoman, you had this done. And there's some thought that maybe it was because when you're winding in a hand line, it might make it easier to be missing, which I've sort of sat there with a little hand line trying to work it out. But so much has sort of been lost, I suppose, with some of the cultural and spiritual beliefs and practices from those times. But pretty interesting story.
Incredible. I think what that does do is it certainly highlights the way that they looked at it, the importance they put upon it. I mean, why would they be doing that otherwise? To say, hey, this is a special thing that we're doing.
Yeah.
And this is how we're sort of acknowledged for it. And it's incredible.
And the I suppose the relationship, the inseparability of the spiritual from the practical. So weaving a fishing net and singing it, singing the fish onto it, or a practice, the Malgan practice. Or women fishing out in their little nowies, singing out to the fishes below.
The fishes.
Yeah.
Why did they have the fire going on the...
To cook. And there's some speculation, and this is, I don't know how many of the guys in the room can identify with this, but there's some speculation that because they wanted to ensure that they got a quick feed before they had to go and give the fish to the blokes.
To the blokes. That'd be about right, wouldn't it? Good on you. So they had to eat before they got home, because the blokes would flog it. Yeah, good on you. Oh, that's so interesting. The other thing that you wrote about in here, which I found really interesting, actually, was the first settlers. When they first came here, they were completely blown away by the abundance of the fish, but they were also baffled by the unpredictability of finding fish. And you know, like that happens even now. Guys will go down and have a fish. They go back the next day. They had a really great day. Go back, or a month later, same tide, whatever it might be, and it's not happening. Now, obviously, we've been educated over time. We sort of know, but the Indigenous knew back then, like their knowledge of moon phases and tides and weather and water temp. You know, do you think, how has that been transferred, or is there any record that was transferred across to the recreational fishermen or to the white settlers?
Yeah, it was knowledge that came pretty slowly. Like there are accounts early on of, as you said, you know, these colossal catches, and then when you fish Sydney Harbour in winter, it suddenly becomes pretty quiet, and you're sort of thinking, hang on, I was literally fishing here last month and bagging out. And there are stories of great kind of hauls of salmon and Aboriginal people coming up and saying, don't take them all. Like, you can't take them all. It's really, really wasteful. Yeah.
Right.
So that they knew that they knew that the weather was changing and that the fishing would be different, and they didn't want this kind of extractive mentality, I suppose. But eventually, you know, over time, over several generations, because the fishing was so fantastic and because it's just so beautiful by the water, as we all know, those of us who love to fish. So increasingly people went down to fish partly to get a feed, because that was really important supplement, and there's no refrigeration, so you can't really go and buy fish in Sydney until the late 1800s, unless you want rotten fish,
right?
Which no one did. So if you want to eat fish or if you want to go fishing, you spend a lot of time down there fishing, and that's how that knowledge comes. Of this is the time, this is the tide, this is the temperature.
Time on water.
It's the time. Observation.
How you learn. Yeah. It's interesting. You sort of think that recreational fishermen nowadays sort of worked it out themselves, but when you really think back to that and you look at those records, you realise that, you know, it was well and truly worked out well before we got here.
Yeah.
They knew exactly what was happening. And what's really interesting too is where the settler came to this country, and I think this was in the UK or wherever it might have been, that you'd have breakfast, lunch and dinner. Whereas they talk about Aboriginal people actually eating when they're hungry, and there's bite times even now for fishing, because fish can't eat 24/7. And they actually say that some of the Indigenous folk were almost in tune with the bite times.
Yeah, wow.
Like either the fish or animals or whatever, when the sun, the moon and the earth are lined up in a certain way. So they wouldn't have set times to eat. They would just eat when they're hungry.
Yeah, wow.
And they're actually in tune. So I think we're pretty far removed from the knowledge that they probably had even now. We've got electronics now and all those sorts of things. But to be perfectly honest, the average fisher even now still doesn't understand the moon phases properly, or how a tide can influence what the fish are doing and the wind. A lot of the time we go fishing when we can, when we've got time to do it, but their knowledge would just be, it'd be just so great to sit down with one of those guys from 200 years ago and say,
amazing.
Tell me, feed me all this
Yes.
information.
And it wouldn't just be about winds and tides and moons. It would be like, there's the first, magpie chick, or there's the, I know that the wattle bloom's out, so the prawns are spawning in the Shoalhaven, or
how it all comes together.
Yeah, really.
Do you think a lot of that knowledge has been passed on through the Indigenous people?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's still there?
Absolutely. And obviously there's very different nations around Australia with very different sort of countries, I suppose, and fisheries. But yeah, absolutely that knowledge is passed along.
Interesting. And what I also found really, and there's a lot of interesting things in there that kind of get you thinking, that a lot of the Aboriginal people down in Tasmania, there's no actual record of them eating fish.
Yeah, that is a very puzzling absence in the archaeological record. For about 3,000 years prior to colonisation, they investigated archaeological remains like middens, which is all the sort of
shells,
the rubbish heaps of communities, and they saw lots of shells and shellfish, different bones of various animals, but no fish bones, and they couldn't understand why they had stopped eating fish for about 3,000 years. And there are lots of different competing views about it. Some people think that they forgot how to fish for fish, which seems...
that doesn't make sense to me.
It doesn't make sense to me. And meanwhile, they were still like diving for abalone and stuff. So it's not as if
you're a
they're not
hunter,
in the water.
You would work it out.
Yeah. And other people were saying that maybe because Tasmania is pretty cold, you need high calorific kind of content, I suppose, that maybe they were moving towards easy gains for high calories like seals and abalone.
Okay.
And then I also read one archaeologist who suggested that maybe there was like a ciguatera poisoning outbreak.
I see.
That might have meant that, but no,
Wow.
of course no one knows.
No one really knows. It was so long ago.
Yeah, that's right.
Really interesting.
Yeah. But there are accounts of Aboriginal women diving into the water. I read this amazing account from a colonial guy who said they descend the kelp like a ladder, down to the bottom to grab abalone off.
Yeah. I've done that myself, and it's exactly what you do.
Yeah.
You use it like a rope, and you pull yourself down.
And they would have had no mask, no wetsuit.
No wetsuit in Tasmania.
Hardcore.
Like what? Speaking of Tassie, 1864, they introduced the trout into Tasmania because they missed their fish.
Yep.
And you mentioned it in the book. Have you actually been down there and done any sort of trout fishing yourself?
I haven't done trout fishing in Tasmania, but I've done a fair bit around the high country in New South Wales, Victoria.
Okay.
Yeah. It's fun.
It's good, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like there's something very, very special about catching trout. They're a really unique species, but you've got to get down to Tassie, mate, let me tell you.
Okay.
And some of the rivers down there, it is a very, very special place.
Yeah.
And the way that the people have embraced trout fishing in Tassie, it's a way of life for those guys down there. And they almost take it for granted. They've got it probably one of the best trout fisheries in the world now. And it's incredible how these fish from the other side of the planet have come over here and they've just done so well. Interestingly as well, a lot of the flies that they brought across from the UK, they wouldn't eat.
Yeah, that's right. They're sort of amazing. Like the people who were determined to bring trout to Australia were so stubborn. They were just like, we want this fish here.
Right.
And they brought lots of other things like deer and rabbits to try and make Australia feel more like home. And we can debate sort of, the ecological problems of trout. But there is no doubt that they are amazingly fun to catch and eat. Really are. And they worked their butts off to get them here. They
had
a lot of trial
and error,
a lot of trial and error. They put them on these kind of moss, packed the kind of eggs in moss and ice, and then the boats took too long and the ice all melted and the sort of eggs all died. Eventually they got here and had the release, because they were sort of back in the kind of old mindset of flies from home and they're sort of fishing in certain ways. Because the fish had kind of indigenised to Australian climate,
Absolutely.
the fishers had to change then as well.
That's right.
And
they started eating different insects.
Yep.
So you've got to start matching the hatch.
Exactly.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Now, a little controversy. I mean, I don't want to stir the pot too much, but you do mention a lot of the stats on fish stocks and the reduction of fish stocks. How much do you think that's actually attributed, in your opinion, to rec fishers versus commercial fishing, really?
Well, I'm going to have two bob each way, but there is no doubt that some species that were commercial only, like southern bluefin tuna, tiger flathead in the 1930s, 40s, orange ruffy. You're not having reccees go out to get orange ruffy or bluefin tuna off, because they just didn't have the boats to be able to do that in the 1950s and 60s.
That's right.
And those stocks collapsed. As soon as industrial fishing came to Australia with...
unregulated.
Not only unregulated, but encouraged by the government. Like the government brought fishing boats over here to exploit this endless natural resource.
Right.
So in the 1930s, they had steam trawlers for the first time, and then within about 15 years, the tiger flathead stocks collapsed off New South Wales. In the 1950s, they brought out tuna pole fishing.
Yep.
They brought the boat out, and within kind of 25, 30 years, the bluefin tuna stocks collapsed. And then the same thing happened with orange ruffy, and the same thing happened with gemfish. So it has been a really... fisheries have been playing catch up with the knowledge of how precarious those seemingly bountiful stocks have been. At the same time, we can't deny that recce's don't have an impact on fish stocks. So I don't think that all the blame can be sheeted home to the commercial industry. And I suspect that as time goes on, there'll be more of a demand for data from recreational fishers about how much they're catching so that they can measure stocks more accurately. Because now that, part of the reason why some commercial stocks are sort of, they're sort of doing okay is because there's been so much monitoring of what's going into the boat.
Yeah.
And that's not to say there's not still waste of, trawler trash and stuff being thrown overboard and those sorts of issues. But the monitoring means that there's a kind of a much tighter kind of knowledge about what's being taken out of the water. And that's much harder to know for recce's.
It's impossible almost.
Yeah.
I mean, there are guys that will go fishing 3 times in a row and be lucky to catch a fish.
That's right.
And other guys will go and they'll get their bag limit. I just know from my own experiences over the years, I've been doing this for a long time, places like Lake Macquarie in New South Wales, St George's Basin down south, used to fish a lot down there. I met an old fella down there, lived there his whole life, and they stopped commercial fishing there quite a few years ago. But he said the fishing in there now, and it gets hammered by recreational fishing, hammered. He said the fishing's better now than it was 40 years ago.
Yeah.
And I know people, Lake Macquarie, exactly the same. They're catching snapper in there.
Yeah.
And even though the rec fishers are really going for it in there, the fish stocks are thriving because it really is a minimal impact as opposed to a big net that's just scooping an entire
and particularly for those kind of catchments. I mean, out in the ocean, it's a slightly different it's a slightly different measurement. But if you're taking a net out of a small system, it's very different.
Yeah.
I remember reading when I was researching this book that they were saying that salmon schools had almost disappeared. I think they were writing it in the mid-1950s or 60s. So that's at the height of the salmon canning industry. And now, like you see, the salmon are so thick because
amazing.
It's only, there's some of a very, very small commercial catch for salmon, which sadly they use for lobster bait. But there's, since the canneries shut, there's just so much salmon. So
it's an ongoing challenge. I mean, there's a demand for seafood, but I seem to think now seafood you buy at a fish market, it's a bit of a rich man's food now.
Yeah, it's $40 a kilo for flatty tails.
Well, mate, even more than that sometimes. Like we just come back from a trip and we very rarely bring fish with us. 90% of the time we're catch and release. And if we do keep and kill a fish, we normally eat it at that time. But when you're fishing deep water, because of barotrauma, the fish are going to die anyway, right? So we take a feed of fish home, and we looked at a box of fish that we brought home, and we worked it out. It was like $600 worth of fish in one little polystyrene that you would buy at the fish market, $70 a kilo on average. So I think rec fishers nowadays, realistically, if they want to eat seafood, for a lot of people in Australia, they've got to catch it themselves. Otherwise, it's just not going to happen.
Totally. And I think, COVID showed us how important fishing is and getting out in nature is.
Well, I have a tackle store, and it was like Christmas.
Yeah, wow.
It went absolutely bananas because people wanted to go fishing.
Yeah. And now with the cost of living, I suppose there's another added element there, which is supplementing your feed. And also, I suspect increasingly there's ethical decisions being made here about, for the most part, you're deep sea fishing as an exception, but for the most part, if I catch a bream that's slightly, I feel like it might be just legal, but give it another day, it's pretty easy to do that. And so I don't tend to buy so much, but when I go fishing, I know what I'm going to get, and I feel like it's, killing an animal it's not a pleasant activity, but it feels like it had a good life. It's humane dispatch.
To me, it feels far more sustainable.
And also I think, it tastes infinitely better than a fish that's been sitting in a net and then sitting in its guts and blood for the next 3 or 4 days.
Well, what's interesting, I'll jump ahead a little bit to what I was going to ask you. I mean, we often get greenies, whatever, write into us on social media or whatever it might be, and how could you have killed that fish? And I actually wrote back, I remember writing back to one lady saying, can I ask you a question? Do you eat tuna?
Yeah.
Canned tuna. Her reply, of course I do. I said, well, just remember that tuna died gasping for air in a massive net with thousands of his mates. And the fish that we took was one fish in one day that we dispatched real quick in an ice slurry. And I just think that whole mentality, I'll go to the supermarket, buy it, but I won't really think about it. But then when I actually physically see someone catch and kill a fish, oh, no, you can't do that.
Yeah.
So I think sometimes we maybe have gone a little bit too far.
Completely.
And I remember back in the day when I was a kid, and I grew up fishing Port Kembla jetties, and you're allowed to walk onto the jetty and fish, and the fisheries guy would turn up, and everybody hated the fisheries guy. In fact, I saw a bunch of guys throw him in the water. Yeah, he's checking everyone's catch and all the rest of it, and a lot of people getting in trouble. Now we're going back 30 odd years. Nowadays, if you see a fisheries guy and you know someone's doing the wrong thing, guys will go, hey, go check that guy, mate.
Yeah.
I think the mentality's changed. I think since, and I got to hand this guy a lot of credit, since Rex Hunt and the old give him a kiss and let him go, the whole catch and release process has made a lot of recreational fishermen almost somewhat conservationists themselves, in that they understand they want their children to be able to do this and their grandchildren. And you put up a photo of a fish that's undersized on social media, oh my Lord, the community hammers them. If we go out fishing and we're on the rocks and we see someone that leaves rubbish behind, man, the rec fishers are into them saying, hey, clean that crap up. So I think the mentality has changed dramatically. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a sort of sense of, back in the 70s or earlier, of just catch until you can't catch anymore, catch until it runs out. If the fish are on, you catch them all. And that has definitely changed. On Facebook, if New South Wales DPI puts up a shot of people nicking shellfish or undersized, the comments are just like... Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
Drill them.
Yeah, totally.
Which I personally think is fantastic.
Yeah.
I think it's just really great.
And, it also shows politically, there's in Western New South Wales, where there are real problems with the health of kind of river systems and fisheries, there's a kind of a political alliance between the greenies and shooters and fishers. Like you said, you might not be a greenie, but you feel like you're an environmental steward. And they're campaigning for a better river. And I would never in a million years have thought that those two groups of people would be kind of allies
I think
for the future.
I would love, and honestly, and I mean this wholeheartedly, I'd love the gap to lessen. And I'm going to give you an example. I'm going to throw someone on the bus here. I sent an email off about a week or so ago to Lady Elliot Island saying we're bringing, I want to bring some of our members out there and go snorkeling and show them, and then maybe talk to you guys about green zones and how important they are and those sorts of things. The reply I got back was, this is a green zone, therefore not appropriate to film fishing addiction. That was the response that I got. And I'm thinking, so straight away you've made the assumption that because we're fishers, we're in the wrong and you're in a green zone and we're too far apart.
Yeah.
And I was so disappointed by that. I'm actually agreeing with them to a certain point.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, when you were saying about, peering back into time, that was the example that was going to come to mind of one of the places where you can go as someone who's mad on fishing and you can stick your head underwater and go, oh, it was kind of probably close to this.
Yeah.
And I love fishing. I also love going to places like that, to green zones, and having a look to see those beautiful things. And I completely agree. There is absolutely seeing those things come together. We should all be supporting access to sustainable fisheries and also those green zones that allow us to kind of see, protected, pristine places.
I unfortunately believe that there is too much political gain by creating some green zones. Like we go out in the Coral Sea and have a reef out there. There is absolutely no science behind it whatsoever, but they make it a green zone. There's no commercial fishing, and there's probably a dozen recreational boats that'll get there once or twice a year, and they'll just close it and call it a green zone. And you can ask all you like, why? Why are you doing that? And no one can actually give you an answer.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, well, is it just to get votes?
It's a really good question. I think one of the things that I have increasingly discovered in researching this book is if you can be told the answer, it goes a long way. Like if someone gave you an answer, I've written into fisheries before asking 100%. Why certain things are in a certain way.
If they came back to me and said it's because of X, Y and Z, Mark, and, we really want to do the right
Yeah.
thing. And I would be like, oh, wow, yeah, great.
Yeah.
But there's no answer. There's no real reason. That reef is no different than that reef. It's not under pressure. We're catching so many fish there. It's insane. I don't get it.
I think it's really
disappointing,
Yeah, I think it's really important just to know why certain things are the way they are. That would go a long way to kind of having trust and faith. And,
Absolutely.
Then that might come down to things like funding the fisheries to be able to have, better comms or those sorts of things. I'm not sure, I'm not in the halls of government. I don't know. But just anecdotally from people I've talked to, they want to be able to, contact their local member or write to the department, and they would be satisfied with
something,
with a genuine response.
Something.
Yeah, for sure.
And look, because
we're all trying to do the right thing. Like, we're all actually trying to make this system better. Both, the scientists and the politicians and everyone's kind of got the same aim, which is to be able to keep fishing in the future.
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
Ideally,
I don't want to be. Look, I don't want to be negative, but I get a feeling like, in the book you refer to a few studies that have been done on fish stocks in certain places and so forth, and I really question whether these studies are even close to being right, and I'm going to do that from my own personal experience. Like, one of them in particular was, I wrote it down. In Tasmania, 2022, the sand flathead deemed to be on the verge of collapse. Now, I have fished down there about 12 months ago, and since then, and the guy I fished with down there, he has lived there his entire life. The flathead are in plague proportions. We caught 100. We were trying to catch a brim, and we probably caught 100 in one day.
Yeah.
Everywhere you looked in the shallows, there were just flathead everywhere. And this is a study that's only 12 months old. Then we went to another system. There was no difference. And on the third day, we went to a third system, and it was exactly the same thing. That I've never seen so many flathead in my life. And then when you hear about a report like that, you seem to think, well, okay, how are they getting this information? How true is it? The other one that we always hear about is how endangered sharks are. I have never seen more sharks in all my travels than I'm seeing now. I'm talking packs of sharks, whereas we used to fish up on top of the reef in the shallows, and it's my favourite for me, catching trout and all sorts of things. We're getting packs of sharks now moving in on top of the reef, chasing your little trout that you hook in. I've never seen more sharks than we're seeing now. Yet there's been some more recreational bans on catching sharks because they're endangered. How much weight do you put in these reports yourself? I mean, you're an academic, right?
Yeah, I mean, I can only go on what governments and fisheries are putting out. But I have you're not the first person to provide that anecdotal information about sand flathead in particular. And I'm on a lot of Facebook groups in Sydney, and the sort of discussions around grey nurse and protection, and not that people want to go out and kill grey nurse, but they're curious as to why they're classified as endangered.
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess it's just up to all of us to keep asking those questions and trying to keep the information coming. I've sort of taken them on face value, and I see the hard work that fisheries scientists do. But yeah, you're definitely not the first person to be asking questions about a sort of the apparent disconnect between some of the decisions that are being made and what people are seeing on the ground.
And the unfortunate part to that is then that flows on to the recreational fishing industry, where a guy can only go down and catch one flathead, for example, or three, whatever it is down there, and then they reduce the bag limit. Well, that affects that bloke going to get a feed of fish, that one fella. Then it also affects the tackle store that's there selling the fishing gear. It affects the petrol station. It affects all the chain reaction because they've got it wrong.
Yeah.
And whether they've just done that to create more work for themselves or so they get their grant the following year, I don't want to say...
I mean, I don't want to speculate either, but maybe there's also a sense of there's been a few examples when not enough was done and things went really pear-shaped. And so maybe there's also a fear of, stuffing up a system as well.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, a friend of mine many years ago had these biologists rock up. He's down in Whyalla in South Australia, and they were talking to him about how, the white pointer is basically almost extinct in this area. And he looked at them and he laughed. He said, I see them every charter. They wouldn't believe him. So he took them out. They saw 5 in a day.
Wow.
They were completely blown away. So they can look at as many reports as they want to, but unless you're on the water and you're spending time on the water, and that's what recreational fishing people can provide.
Yeah.
And I think there maybe needs to be some sort of better connection between these stats and rec fishers. But at the same time, rec fishers don't want to give too much away because in the past, right, and I'll never forget this, on the south coast of New South Wales, they wanted to create these zones and they asked fishermen, where do you not want us to close? And so they told them their favourite, and guess where they closed? So that real, there's a real distrust there of government.
Which is such a shame. But it does come back to our point earlier about the need for data on rec fishing, because maybe some of those decisions about fisheries closures or protections, if there was actual data about what's being caught and how much is being caught, that would feed into the sort of stock assessments.
Yeah, but again, it can work the other way. They see people that are catching lots and lots of flathead in a particular area. Like, oh, they got 20, 30. Man, they're going to wipe it out. We better close it down.
Yeah, that's true.
That's their worry, right? So it's a very precarious situation. And, you know, you're always going to get two sides to this story, always. Rec fishers, no, we don't damage stocks. Whereas I do see people doing the wrong thing on a regular basis as well. So they're not completely innocent, don't get me wrong, but I definitely think there are some conflicting information there for fishers. Anyway, moving right along. As I say, I don't want to be negative, but yeah, I find it hard sometimes to read those things and really think, okay, I can't count that as fact. So
You're not the first person who said that to me.
Okay, good. What do you think the future holds for rec fishers? You know, are we taking the bag limits too far, do you think? Is this passion that we have, right? This passion that we have that, you know, I've tried to pass on to my kids. They're not into it like I am. That's just how it is. But that passion that's been instilled in us for years, do you think that will continue?
I do, and I'm not a fisheries scientist, so I can't sort of, say if things have been taken too far or not. But in terms of that passion, there is absolutely, like, as long as there are fish to be caught sustainably, and you said, as you said before, you know, our attitudes to some of the ways we fish might change and shift slightly from the kind of catch-all mentality, you know, a generation or two ago, to this more stewardship kind of mentality. But the thrill of catching a fish is the same thrill.
It is. And
the desire to be able to pass it on is the same desire. And maybe we're doing it better and we're doing it differently. But I actually think those feelings of fishing and you know, you opened with that scene of the book at the beginning with the sort of sun catching the side of your face. Yeah. I think that's pretty enduring, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you might be right. Yeah. So where can people buy this book? Obviously, I saw it at Darwin Airport.
Yeah, Darwin Airport. Get into it. It's only $400 one way. All good bookshops, online, bookstores, and at your local as well in real life.
Well, I really enjoyed it. It actually stirred up some emotions in me, positive and negative, and I like to be challenged like that, which is really good. And I think a lot of rec fish shows will feel the same. But one thing that really came out of it for me, which I really enjoyed, was the Indigenous side of things, because we often forget that.
Yeah.
You know, we take that for granted, their knowledge. They were here first, and the fishing that they would have experienced, well, we can only just imagine.
Oh my God, absolutely. And people have been fishing in this place that we love for a really, really long time.
They have. The way technology's going now, like, I don't know if you've seen it on a lot of the boats when you go fish for barramundi or whatever it might be, they're using a live target. Have you seen that? So basically you have a screen in front of you, and rather than just your normal sounder, it actually shows you a live feed of what's under the boat. So you can say, I can see on this angle at about 20 feet, there's a barramundi swimming. So you can actually cast directly to it.
Wow.
You can actually dangle your lure right in front of its nose, and you can see on that screen. It's not like watching TV. It's a fuzzy, but you know what it is.
I've only seen the side ones.
The side imaging's there, but that's like a dead image, right? This is actually live, so you can actually see the fish swimming.
Oh, wow.
And you can actually put your lure in front of its nose and keep teasing it till it eats it. Is it too far?
Oh gosh, that's a great question. I mean, I suppose if the limits are in place for what we can catch, then it's
how you catch it doesn't matter.
But how you want to catch it and how you want to go fishing. I mean, sometimes that's half the fun. Think of the people who get sea lettuce to get a ludrick. You know, there are easier ways of getting a ludrick.
Yeah, there really
But there's
is.
something about the delight and the challenge of going on
Part
a
of the
rock
process,
cloth
isn't it?
Yeah, in winter. And so those processes are important, and it's like fly fishing or lure fishing for trout. People do what makes them, happy and enjoy the kind of hunt, I suppose. Yeah.
Well, we love that you're a big nerd and that you love fishing.
Thank you,
It's
Mark.
sensational.
Yeah, cheers.
Are there other people that you work with, that are academics, that have a similar sort of passion for fishing, or are you a rarity?
I think I'm a rarity, to be honest. I have met a few people who are keen in the sort of university world, maybe more in science and outdoorsy stuff.
Yeah.
Rather than in history per se. I reckon, over in the ocean sort of studies departments, they'd be
They'd
keen
into it.
fishers. Yeah, I reckon.
So is this your first book?
No, it's my first book about kind of fishing. It's my first book of environmental history. But
How many books have you written?
Oh, I don't know, 6, 7.
Are you serious?
7, something like that.
Yeah, clever cookie. What's the 7? We've been told 7.
Okay.
Yeah, he's a nerd. He's a fan. What's the next one for you?
Well, I'm going to stick with the water. I'm writing a history of the beach.
That's cool. And what about the beach? Just our love affair with it, like fishing?
Our love affair with it. Well, the thing I'm really interested about beach history is it's like an idea that we have when we think of the beach. Everyone talks about the beach as this kind of idea, but it's also actually a real place. And so I'm interested in thinking about those things. Yeah.
Everyone loves the beach.
Everyone loves the beach, exactly.
Yeah. And we're completely surrounded by them.
Exactly. I mean, here we are, like right here.
Yeah.
at the beach.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you want to add or talk about?
No, I think that was good.
You feel pretty cool?
Yeah.
With that?
Thank you. Thanks for reading it so thoroughly.
No, that's all right. I just didn't want to. I mean, from a hardcore recreational fisherman standpoint, I just wanted to make sure that I didn't want to push you too hard on some of those things, but at the same time, you'll get fishers that will read parts of that and go, "Hang on, that's just bullshit."
No,
and
totally.
it's not you saying it; it's just
Totally.
what you're reporting back and the
Yep.
information you've been given.
Yep. I'm totally across that. I'm actually part of the on the rec advisory thing for New South Wales DPI. So
I was on that too.
Yeah, they get it a lot.
Yeah,
And they should. That's the point about, and I think rec fishers are important citizen scientists.
Well, I think there's a stat that I heard years ago, and it was like rec fishers have 1% impact on fish stocks. And that's something I heard, and I cannot tell you where I heard that, but how would they ever work that out?
Well, that's it's so important to know. And on all of these other debates about, catch limits and bag limits come from better understanding.
Although I do wonder, do we really need to know when we look at places that have had commercial fishing shut down, and even though they get smashed by rec fishers, they're still thriving.
Yeah.
So you wonder, does it even matter? Is the main problem these giant nets taking out massive schools of fish, whether it's in enclosed waters or offshore? I mean, it's an unknown, isn't it? The ocean, well,
it moves.
yeah, it does. Exactly right. And fish have tails, and they do too.
Yeah.
So it's a real tricky one. But our love affair with it, I don't think will ever go away.
No, and I think that's the kind of key, I suppose, is that we can, disagree about or question different reports and different mechanisms, but there is actually a belief in going to the same place together. And maybe there are degrees of how to get there, but it's not like we're envisaging different futures.
Yeah, that's right. I think
And that's important.
I don't know about that either, because I think there are some that would like to see rec fishing stop.
I mean the people who are trying to manage rec fisheries.
Manage rec fishing,
and people
yeah.
who are keen fishers. I don't mean the whole
Yeah.
population.
Yeah.
There are obviously some people who object to any form of fishing whatsoever. But in terms of those of us who are keen fishers,
we're heading in the right direction.
And I think we are believing in the same thing, which is a fishery we can pass on.
Do you know, it does cross my mind sometimes when we're out there and we're making a show and the fishing's great, that I wonder if people will be looking back on this in, 20, 50 years, whatever it might be, going, geez, look how it used to be.
Yeah, how sick it was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I just so hope that that's not the case.
Absolutely.
I also hope they look back and go, look how tough he did it back then.
But I mean, you can see that even with Sydney Harbour since they closed that
That's
off.
fantastic.
It's amazing. So there are pathways where you can look back and go, oh gosh, that's sad how that was. Look where we've gone.
Yeah.
Look where we've come.
Yeah, that's cool. Well, Anna, thank you so much for coming. Do you have any questions for us?
No, that was just great. Thanks for having me.
No, our pleasure.
Yeah, cheers, mate.
Shake hands. Good on you, mate.